Hi, I'm Marcia with the Office of Christian Care and Counseling, and I have some amazing families here with me today as we discuss suicide awareness, prevention, and intervention. So I will allow my families to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Shanika Lett.
I am Gerald Holden, the proud father of three.
I am Jocelyn Jones.
So thank you. I'm so excited to have you all here. So let's jump into it. I'm going to give you little stats and little formal information, and then we're going to have a chat. So according to the CDC and the National Institutes of Mental Health, suicide rates have increased 35% since 1999. Nearly 48,000 lives were lost to suicide in 2019 alone. So that was even before the pandemic. So comments or thoughts about suicide, also known as suicidal ideation, can begin small, like things like, I don't want to be here. I don't want to live. Nothing matters. But over time, they can be more explicit and dangerous. Suicide is preventable. Did you all know that?
Yeah.
You knew that? Okay, great. So we're here to talk about awareness, prevention, and intervention, which are the keys to keeping people alive. So suicidal thoughts are a symptom, just like any other disease. They can be treated and they can improve over time. Suicidal thoughts are common. They can be temporary and managed. But of course, if left unresolved, those thoughts can be more frequent, they can last longer, and then the effects can be more devastating. So it's amazing that over the last decade, suicide rates in the United States have increased dramatically among racial and ethnic minorities, particularly in our community of Black Americans. The death rate for suicide for Black or African American men was 4 times greater than African American women in 2018. Wow. Did you all know that? No. Okay. And in 2019, suicide was the leading cause of death in African Americans ages 15 to 24.
In 2019?
In 2019, before the pandemic.
Scary.
Wow. Yeah. So that's why it's really important that we're having this conversation. That's one of the reasons why we want to shed light, especially in our community, because we don't usually talk about suicide. There's a stigma around it. There's a fear. And there's a misnomer that people in Black and brown communities are not attempting or dying by suicide. So that's why we need to have this conversation. We want to dispel those myths. And because you all have young people, 1 in 6 youth ages 16 to 17 experience a mental health disorder, every year. 1 out of 6 high school students have considered suicide. So you have high schooler, you have a high schooler, and you have an up and coming high schooler, right? Your son's they're both in high school. Okay, sorry. So think about that. 1 in 6. And we had some youth here, earlier when we were talking to the youth, 1 in 6. And that's a lot if you think about that. And 50% of lifetime mental illness begins by age 14. So just some interesting facts about that. And then the other thing to bring light to is the LGBTQ plus community. Those youth and questioning youth, they're 4 times more likely to attempt a suicide versus a straight youth. So something else to consider if any of your youth are in that particular population. And just one last thing, on average, in the United States, 1 person dies by suicide every 11 minutes. So imagine every 10, 15 minutes, somebody is dying by suicide.
Those stats, all of the stats I think that you mentioned it's hard to sometimes to take that in because it seems so unreal when you think about there are people, especially when it doesn't impact your world directly.
Right.
And it's hard to hear those numbers because there are a lot of people, I think, suffering silently.
Absolutely.
And ultimately ending their lives, unfortunately.
Right. Any other thoughts about those stats? Things that come to mind?
Yeah, I think about how my kids just went to a pep rally and it's the entire school population. And you think 1 in 6 of that entire school population, what that actually look like.
Yeah.
It's very, very scary, and you always say, oh, that won't happen to me, it won't affect me, but it can. And when you hear those stats, because you know it's happening when you just hear like you just said like every 11 minutes somebody.
Yeah.
Like that's like an eye opener.
Absolutely. And it is scary. And it's one of the reasons why it's important to have these conversations in our community and outside of our community. Because I know when I was growing up, we didn't talk about suicide,
Right.
especially in the Black church. Like we weren't talking about it because we were always taught, well, Black people don't die by suicide. That's a myth, of course. And even now, part of the conversation is because of more, I don't say popular, but it's in the news more, where we've had more celebrities. We've had some pageant queens die by suicide. Some celebrity children have died by suicide that have been either Black or brown, which is bringing heightened awareness that it is in our community and has been for years. We just haven't been talking about it. But those stats are startling, especially when you think 1 in 6,
Right.
or you think about it being the second leading cause of death in that age category. Of 10 to 34 years old, that's a high number in terms of second leading cause of death is suicide.
Yeah.
So just something to think about. And when I had the conversation with the youth, we were talking about Black males. Their rate is extremely high. Black females attempt more, but Black males are more successful in their attempt to die by suicide. So that's just another startling fact that some people just don't know.
Yeah.
So what we want to do is just get in the position of starting to have those conversations with our family members, understanding prevention is key to having the conversation, and then, God forbid, having to do an intervention, but giving everyone those tools and strategies of what to do and how to do it. But before we even get into that, do you all have any questions or concerns or things that you want to know that we want to make sure that we cover before we start?
I have some questions. So, I do have 2 girls, but I also work in the school system, and I volunteer a lot at church with the youth, and so I want to be aware not just for my girls, but for all that I interact with. So, like, what are some of the signs that you can look for? Like, specifically, I work with children with autism or learning disabilities. What kind of things should look for if they're nonverbal or they can talk but they don't know how to express what it is that they're feeling? Like if they say I'm sad, but you ask them why you feeling sad and they don't know how to express that, right? What kind of things could we look for?
So that's a really good question. And just in general, the warning signs are going to be similar across populations. However, in cases of special needs or autism and things like that, it's the heightened outside of their baseline.
Okay.
And so being aware of what that baseline looks like, because the signs are still going to be same, maybe agitation, but elevated, versus what their baseline is. Changes in behavior, changes in, mood and attitude. But within those populations, you have to kind of know the baseline, and you also have to kind of have that relationship where you know the nuances when something is off. But the signs are going to be the same. It's just, can I identify them? And if they're nonverbal, what other ways are they communicating that are not their normal mode?
Right.
And so just being really aware, but it is very tricky, but the signs are going to be the same. And we can talk about those. So, changes in appetite, changes in sleeping, agitation. If they're easily agitated, that's their baseline. But if it goes even higher in elevation, that's a warning sign. Of course, if they're withdrawing more than normal, and if you just can't get them to, or if they're nonverbal, then if they're not communicating at all how they normally communicate, that's a sign. But if they're verbal and they stop verbalizing, or they start to withdraw, or they stop interacting, and what their baseline is, that's another warning sign. Neglecting their personal appearance outside of what their normal daily
teenage stuff is.
Their normal teenage stuff, right? But you can kind of that's another thing, being aware and present of your own children's baseline and or those you're working with, right? Because those little nuances that sometimes we discount is an actual warning sign. So just being aware of that. Taking some trainings too, we can talk about that too. There's mental health first aid for youth, which is an excellent program that can give caregivers, parents, and lay people information on how to look for those signs, how to triage. So that's another kind of resource that we can provide at the end of this, and something like that. Just additional training, having conversations, getting information, talking to other mental health clinicians, what do you see or what advice do you have, things like that.
Okay.
Do you have another question?
So as an educator,
Mhm.
like, how do you know, like, where your part is? So like, so with my kids, with my students, I can tell if their behavior is different than how it is, and then so I'll contact parents and be like, hey, did something in their routine change at home or something like that? But like after you relay it to the parents, like, what do you do then? Like, is that where you pass the baton, or do you still? Is there another part for you to play to make sure that?
Ooh, that's a really hard one. I think that as an educator, and I used to teach, right? There's the legality of things, there's the morality and the ethics of things, and then there's how you want to operate and how that all mixes in, right? For me, and the legality is, if you're in the school system, you're a mandated reporter.
Mm-hmm.
And so once you pass that off, you may not get information.
Right.
And so for you may have to realize this is where it stops. And or if you have a relationship with the family, like, there's a lot of teachers who have relationships with the families, they have phone numbers and things like that. If you're comfortable, once you pass it off, you could reach out to them directly, but being sensitive that this is a confidential matter, and knowing that once you pass it off in the school system, you're not going to get that information unless there's a higher level, like an investigation or something happens. But I think it's one of those sticky things where you have to personally decide, am I going to be okay once I report it and just letting it go? Or do I want to follow up? And knowing if you go to follow up, the school system is not going to tell you. But being aware, you can talk to the family. I would not suggest talking to like friends and things like that, just because they may not know that something has happened. But it's really it's hard. Once you elevate it, it's really hard to not know what has happened until the student comes back.
Yeah.
Or if there's a meeting, sometimes in school systems, there's a crisis meeting for reintegration for that student to come back, and then you might get information. So does that help?
Please. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Just with youth in general, we're not always the ones that with certain stuff, parents are not the ones that your kids want to come to, but you still want to make sure that you're creating like a safe space.
Absolutely.
You want them to know, like, hey, you can come and talk to me. And a lot of times I think parents, we say that, like, you can come and talk to me. So it's kind of just like a tip, just like when they do finally come to you, like, make sure that you're listening to what they're saying. Because us as parents, we want to fix our kids. We want to make sure they're okay. But in doing so, you can kind of have them to be like, see, I knew I shouldn't have told you, so I'll come and talk to you. So just like, what does that look like with creating that space, that safe space for them? And then when they do come, like, kind of channeling yourself and telling yourself, okay, as much as you want to talk, and like say, well, maybe you do this, but just to sit there and listen.
So that's a great question. We'll talk about that now and we'll reiterate it later on. But one of the biggest things in creating that space is getting comfortable with silence and getting comfortable actively listening and removing your personal agenda outside of safety, right? I mean, that's our agenda. We all want our children to be safe, but creating that safe space of one, asking your youth, right? When you come to me with something that you think I'm going to feel some kind of way, or I'm going to be angry, how do you want me to receive it? How do you want me to show up for you? But have those conversations proactively before there's a situation, and then kind of practice and model it, right? So that's one thing, asking your child, what do you need from me when you come to me? Right. And then really checking self, right? How will I handle my reactions? Like for me personally, I have facial expressions that tell it all. Right. And so that's one of the things for me, I've got to check myself. Like, when my sons come to me with X, Y, and Z, check your face because that's going to give it away, right? But being aware of what your body language is or your triggers, what is going to make you uncomfortable? How can I check that before I need to engage with my child? And that might mean when they come to you, you say, this is really important, but I need a moment to get myself together and I'm going to come back, or we'll come back in 5-10 minutes or whatever, right? Because sometimes we're so busy to like engage with them that we can't even check ourselves to be present. So being present, actively listening, this one's hard, removing judgment about what they're about to tell you. Because what they're about to tell you may go against your own personal system of beliefs or core values, right? Especially if it has to do with sexual identity or drugs or alcohol or anything like that, right? What they're about to, or sex, or suicide, you know what we're talking about, right? It may go against your beliefs and your core values. And that's important to share with them, but maybe not at that moment, because we want to be really careful of blaming, shaming, and judgment when they're coming to us with that. So that active listening and really listening to understand and not respond, which goes to the fixing part, right? Because when our kids come to us, we immediately go into fix mode, rescue, right? And we're not listening. We're like, okay, but this is what you need to do. And sometimes it's not saying this is what you need to do, but how can I support you? What is it you need from me? And then we can come up with a plan of execution or intervention. Because sometimes they may have a great idea. Like we discount sometimes our youth's ability to self-solve sometimes. Even when they elevate it to us. Sometimes they're just like, I just need this. Oh, okay. You didn't need me to go through all these 15 steps.
Right.
You know? So I think it's really just, and creating the safe space of, what does that look like proactively and what does that look like in a crisis, right? So, and creating like maybe weekly conversations, family chats, dinner chats. They don't always have to be formal. It could be in the car. I've had some of the best conversations with my boys in the car, right? About serious stuff. It could be, you know, the basketball court, you know, it could be, you know, mani-pedis or whatever, right? Sometimes doing those activities release the stress and the anxiety of talking about something really serious, like we're going to sit at the dinner table and we're going to talk about this. Well, you can, but that adds additional stress, if you know, sometimes. So does that help?
Yes. Thank
Okay.
you. That was very, very helpful tips.
Anything else about that, creating that safe space? And
No, I think one of the things I probably take the most offense to as a father is if I'm not the first person.
Thank you for
if I'm not
mentioning
the
that.
first line of defense.
yes,
Simply because I think in my own mind I am creating or cultivating
Yes.
an experience for them.
yes.
And when I'm rejected in that way, maybe I do feel some kind of a way. So I am very mindful of how I respond to them when I respond.
Mhm.
But I think I would be crushed
Yes,
if, you know, they were in crisis
Yes.
and they didn't choose me,
absolutely.
you know, and I say to help, but even to listen. And so that's kind of where I'm transitioning, because at a certain point, it's like your parents are cool and they're not
Right.
cool. And it's like, oh, I'll
Yes.
never talk to my parents. And I'm always keenly aware of the options that they have
Absolutely.
and wanting to be their first choice.
Yeah.
Because again, their peers may be ill-informed, misinformed, and other people may have other agendas. And as their father, I want to be a protector.
Absolutely.
So I try to create those pockets of peace for them.
Yes.
It's like, hey, how you doing?
Mhm.
Like, what's,
Mhm.
and it'll be random. Like, we'll just throw out a random topic. It's like, oh, dad.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, but I want you to be comfortable.
Right.
Feeling like you can talk to me about those things. But I do need to, I do have to check myself in
Yeah.
that way too.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up. And that's part of like the self-reflection, right? And it's knowing that you've empowered your youth to talk to a trusted adult. And the reality is, and the painful reality is, it may not be you.
Right.
But don't push that off on them. Deal with that behind the scenes, right? So when they come to you secondarily and you know they've already gone to somebody else, don't put that blame and guilt on them, right? Just maybe even acknowledge, like, I'm so glad you talked to somebody. Now you're here, let's talk. Not the because we as parents be like, why didn't you come to me first? Well, you know, you could have come to me, and that feeds into whatever their reason was why they didn't come to you first.
That's true.
And then, you know, not getting all counseling and psychological, but checking yourself for what is it with you that makes it more important to be, and you should feel it, right? But you're now making it about you that they didn't come to you first,
Absolutely.
right? So just checking that and processing that. But that's a normal thing. Like we want our kids to come to us, and it is painful, and you feel rejected when they don't. So acknowledging that, but creating that space of you working that out behind the scenes and not like with them. So that was a great point. I'm so glad you brought that up.
So to that point when you were saying like, because I teach my girls like if you can't come to me, then we have like trusted people, like trusted adults that they can go to. So how would you say to handle like, so say one of my kids went to one of their trusted adults and it would same thing like with counseling, if they say something about hurting themselves or hurting others, and they come and tell that trusted adult to tell me. So how would I then address it with my youth without them feeling betrayed by the person they talk to?
That's the thing about creating the village and the conversation with your group. There are certain things that are off limits that are kept secret or kept confidential. And so you would need to tell those individuals that have been empowered in your circle to talk to your children that, hey, if they come to you with these topics, let them know, I appreciate you coming to me, but this is not something that I can hold in confidence against, away from your parents, right? And let them have that conversation. And also tell your children, I want you to be able to talk to adults about these things. However, if you go to another adult and share these topics that you predetermined, suicide would be one of them, that adult is going to come and tell me.
Okay.
But it's also important for you to tell those adults to tell your daughter, in your case, the same thing. Because like I do that with teens that I work with all the time. You can tell me anything you want, but these certain things, I will be notifying your parents.
Okay.
You can also advocate and say, we can go and tell your parent together, that kind of thing. Or I will give you a couple hours to go talk to your mom. And if you don't do that, I'm still going to talk to her either way, but I'll allow you to find that space for a few moments. Otherwise, this is what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Kind of giving them some power, but not all the power, because you need to know.
Right.
So the important thing is just to let whoever they go to let them know that, hey, I am going to tell your mom or
absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And if that conversation didn't happen, they may have to either circle back around to make a repair with your child, or you may have to say, unfortunately, these are the topics that are off limits that are not to be kept from me.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other things about that? Yeah.
I think something that comes up for me is the difference between if my child is coming to me to talk about something serious about someone else, like a friend or a peer, versus something serious about that. It's almost like I have to put on a different type of listening cap and be able to check my own emotions. Because it's about a friend, let me help, how can I help kind of thing, versus if it's my child, I got to check my fear.
Absolutely.
My concern.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. And that's kind of one of the things to check, right? When it's your own child, because then we start to have our own insecurities come up, like, am I doing this right? Or did I do something wrong? Or I'm afraid this, that, those different things. So there's a lot of psychological mind game playing that you have to do when it's your child and they're coming to you, which is why I said, if you have to take a moment, you might have to take a moment and just say, I just need a pause. I have to collect myself, instead of possibly continuing the conversation and then it going awry and you're like, oh, if I just take it a moment. I think you were going to say
something. I think to your point, I'm always mindful of when my kids come to me and say, oh, well, my friend is having this experience and they're sharing with me another perspective, right? So I usually try to take that same approach, like I'm talking to them about an issue they are having
Right.
personally, as
Okay.
opposed to taking another approach. Oh, but I mean, I can't believe, or he shouldn't do this, or she should be doing that. And then it's like, it sets up this notion that if this was my issue, and I'm talking to this dude, like, he wilding out on my friend, like, I just want to make certain that I would be offering them,
Yeah.
again, the same kind of advice,
Mhm.
to their friend,
Right.
as I would be offering, because I think a lot, these
You're
kids
like,
will test you in ways you don't even
I
know.
know.
It's like,
I know.
I got this friend, and they're thinking about it, so you're the friend the whole time.
Right.
But again,
Right.
it's like our response to them in that moment. So I just try to be mindful of every conversation I'm having with them,
Absolutely.
so I don't alienate or miss an opportunity to share with them. I think my perspective.
Yeah. So that was great. So let's jump into preparing. We've kind of talked about creating the space, kind of checking our judgment and bias and, feelings, thoughts, fears, right? Let's talk about preparing for the conversation, right? And that's the part where we've talked a little bit about that, creating the safe space, checking your own judgments and bias and thoughts about suicide, right? Even your religious thoughts about it. Those are things that we have to think about when we're preparing to have the conversation. Do I want to add that or do I not? Again, get comfortable having the conversation, preparing to have the conversation. That might mean you and some other friends, or you and your partners, your spouses, kind of role playing back and forth before you have the actual conversation. It sounds silly, but sometimes we're like, let me just have this conversation, and it doesn't flow. So if you can kind of practice it, especially since it's suicide, and that's not something that we're sitting around the dinner table talking about. So kind of maybe practice, have some talking points, determine the best time, not only for you to have the conversation, but for your youth, right? And adjust as needed, right? Because just because it's a good time for us may not be a good time for them. If they're getting prepared for the SAT, this might not be a good time to have this conversation. Right. So just being mindful of that, because as parents, we're like, I need to talk to you now. And we think, let's do it. And they're not in a good space. So thinking about that. And part of preparation is also knowing what accommodations your youth might need and having the conversation. So if they have any special needs, if maybe ADHD or any other ability that needs that special attention, keep that in mind. If you're planning to have this conversation, when is the best time of the day for them, based on attention span or based on whatever other accommodations that they need to have? It's kind of like when they're in school, they have their specific accommodations if your child has that. But we as parents forget. We forget, like, oh, they're not going to listen to me if it's this time, because that's when they're whatever. So just being aware of that. Understand for yourself how much information you need to have and how much you want to pass on to your youth. So that's the risk factors, warning signs, understanding the difference between self-harm and suicide. Self-harm and mutilation is very high in youth, but it does not necessarily mean that they want to commit suicide. It's another level. And I think one of our youth mentioned that it's a different mentality. So just kind of understanding self-harm and mutilation is different than the mentality that somebody's going to have for suicide. So one is pain and pain management, which is the self-harm, mutilation, and suicide is actually wanting to end their life, and just understanding the difference, but also monitoring for both. Because there's a lot of, and even in our community, they are cutting. And self-harm includes cutting, any type of pain, like bruising, harming themselves with like fire, I said cutting, any of those harmful physical behaviors, that would be the self-harm injury. And really paying attention to the influence that social media has, but also these challenges. There are a lot of challenges out there that are encouraging youth to do crazy things that can end in death. And as a parent, it's hard to know what those are, but try to find an end to figure out what are these latest challenges? What are they watching on TikTok? And what are they saying on Snapchat? And whatever other secret social media platforms that are out there that we don't know about.
Right.
The underground ones, I'll say. And we talked about this ad nauseum, but being present, learning to be present. right? And even when I was talking to the youth earlier, that was their thing, like be present. But what does that mean for your child? Right? Putting the phones away, having conversations, and decide, do you want to have conversations face to face or do you want to have side by side conversations? What is most comfortable for both? Because as parents, we usually like, I need to talk to you and you need to look at me in my face and right here, eye contact, right? And that may not work for every conversation that you need to have. Side by side conversations can still be as effective. It's not a sign of disrespect. And then actually, especially when you're talking about situations like, or topics like suicide or other really highly challenging conversations, side by side conversations make it less challenging, especially for your youth. It may for parents, we're all like, you don't look at me. But for the youth, it takes away some of the stress and some of the like, oh my gosh, they're staring into my brain.
But it's interesting because there's so many different approaches, right? And I think as a parent, I've never had a lot of these conversations with my parents. And so I think that, I'm doing the noble thing by at least being open.
Oh yeah.
And in creating, hopefully those safe spaces, but like even the nuances, how a kid could perceive, a father as being domineering, like staring him in the face, like, do you hear me? Like that kind of thing. And this is really enlightening for me because I think my approach is probably straightforward. I'm really blunt when I talk to them. So I can imagine, if it's not their style, like, Dad just talked to me in the living room and this is crazy.
Right.
And here I'm thinking, I'm creating this opportunity for my kids to come and talk to me. It's like, well, why wouldn't they talk to me?
Right.
So, I mean, this is just great for me personally, if nobody else benefits.
I think you brought up a great point. Understanding your child's communication style. Because for you, you're very direct, right? But your boys may not be. So you've got to communicate, and we've got to learn to communicate with our children the way that they communicate and the way they receive it. Because that directness could be scary. I'm just, I'm saying, right? Like my dad just talked to me about this, and now I'm just like, and you're like, I just had a conversation.
Oh, it's so good.
Take that really well. And they were like, man.
Right.
They're over here like,
where are my trusted adults? Because he talks about this dude, about my dad.
But you made up a good point though, because you was like, you have these conversations with your parents because, like a lot of times in the Black community, like when things are going on, especially if it's something that's happening in the house, that saying like what goes on in this house stays in this house, and that's not healthy. And so sometimes I think we as the next generation, we tend to sometimes overcompensate because we don't want to be that, but and overcompensating, you're actually doing like the same result, but not trying to. So it's like, where do you draw that line? So that's why, it's important to know like what your kids need and to have those conversations. And then you have to have that conversation, because I think when you first have it, they're going to be looking like it's a test. So you got to like continue to do it and like, hey, it's okay. Like, tell me like how you feel. So like me and my girls, we have let's talk about a moment. So if somebody wants to talk, they'll say, let's talk about it. And then you'll respond, let's talk about it. And that's for them to have the floor. That's something that we just started trying out. And it's for them to have the floor. And so I have to check myself that whatever they're saying, I have to sit back because they have the floor. And then I can respond when I say, so then it's my turn to respond when I say, let's talk about it. And then they say, let's talk about it. And then they hear me, what I'm saying. And we found that, for at least for now, that has been working to get like those things out. So that's me kind of creating a space or whatever it is that you want to talk about. Like there's no limits, because I need them to be able to.
I think that's an excellent idea. Yeah. And I think that's a great idea to have for every family to figure out what their let's talk about it looks like, and to have that and to do it like proactive, like you plan it. And so that now, okay, every so often we're going to have these let's talk about it conversations. It could be something else that, you all come up with. It could be a talking stick. Whoever has a talking stick talks and then you pass it, that kind of stuff. But I think thinking about it from that perspective and even empowering your youth, like how can we have these more robust conversations? And it's not just me talking to you, but you're talking to me and we're getting this exchange. And then I can be your front line, you can come to me first instead of like,
or else.
All right. So any questions about just the preparation before we shift to preparing to have the actual conversation about suicide. Because this was all about preparing.
This is just knowing like what signs to look for, because like even when you talk about suicide, there's different ways to have suicide. You can do it yourself, or like we said, often like suicide by cop, or
That's very good.
or like especially being like in like the church. Like I know when I was younger, I was taught that suicide is sin, and so you believe in that. You like you may not want to do it yourself, because you're like,
like a sister.
I don't want that, but so you'll do something like you're in a
Like
bad
running into a
neighborhood,
car.
or like you're in a bad neighborhood, so you go out at like 3 o'clock in the morning when you know crime is high, because like if somebody else does it to me, then technically I didn't commit suicide,
Right.
But that's still like you still want to end your life, so it's like looking for like all of those signs too.
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, aside from the normal risk factors, about warning signs would be like we had talked about before: change in mood, change in eating, sleeping, parents, alcohol use, things like that. It could be risky behavior, increased risky behavior, or them switching their normal mode of operation. Like if they're going out into different neighborhoods and that's not normal. If they're even talking more about death and dying, it sounds like their conversation is more obsessive about it, or writing about it. Some people write these manifestos beforehand that are very dark, things like that. But that's a really good point, putting yourself in harm's way on purpose.
Yeah.
So that's a really good point too. So just being aware of that, aside from, the other warning signs that we had talked about before. We're going to talk about what the conversation should and could look like as you package it the way you need to for your families. But we were saying, what do you think it should look like? Right.
So in my mind, I think I'm creating this safe space. I'm creating an opportunity for me and my kids to have a conversation about a topic that, I won't say that we know the most about, but it's something that I want to safeguard them from. And so even we were talking earlier about body language and like all of those things that in my mind, I think having the conversation is success, because the conversation wasn't had with me. So nobody talked about suicide with me. So now it's like, all right, well, I got kids. Like I need to make certain that they know what's happening in the world. So maybe having a conversation from my vantage point is not enough if I don't understand how they need to receive the information that or the conversation that we're about to have. So for me, in terms of prevention, so what do I need to be talking to them about? Like, how do I adjust myself in order to have an effective conversation with them about suicide prevention?
And to have yourself be mentally prepared for what they're going to say.
Right.
Well, I think part of it is preparation. It's also age appropriateness, knowing where they are in their age group, what their possibly what do they already know, right or wrong information, right? Because they have information from their peers that can be right or wrong. So it's kind of evaluating self, which we had talked about before, like your own stuff, right? And doing some research, of course, and deciding how much information do you want to give your youth? Do you want it to be very clinical? Do you want it to be more factual with stats? Do you just want it to be let's just have this conversation, and I want to share with you how important it is that I care for you and I love you, and I want to tell you that, but I also want to create this space where we can have these conversations. So yes, there are high level things that you might want to include. And one of those things is determining the difference between self-harm and suicide, making sure that you understand that and they understand it. But the other part is, and this seems very obvious, but it's not, is the finality of suicide. So for some people, depending on their age, their level of awareness, their understanding, some youth don't get that suicide is the final, final. If it's
video games.
Right. So exactly. So their perception of death sometimes when they play these video games and the people, they die and then they get back up, right? Or you see these movies and they die and come back. So that's what I'm saying, being very definitive that if the attempt is all the way through, there's no coming back. No, but without shaming, right? And that's the fine balance, right? But giving the information where you're comfortable, where you want to include faith, but not shaming it with the faith piece. So that what we all grew up knowing, if you die by suicide, you're going to hell. We have to be very mindful of how we pass that on, because that can cause shame and guilt in the person that we're talking to, and it's not a deterrent. Right. So as we're having these conversations, we think, well, if I tell you that this is a sin, and for some people that may make a difference, but for some people it's not a deterrent. And so we have to be aware of that message that we're giving from that religious standpoint. And so having the conversation really is you sitting down, and I hate to say it, but formally thinking out, what is it that I need to tell them? What do I want to tell them? But more importantly, how do I need to share it so that they receive it? Which comes into play, timing, if there's any accommodations, things like that.
Right.
In gathering the information, I say practice, kind of role play it out, because the more comfortable you are before you have the conversation, the more comfortable it will flow. It's still going to be uncomfortable. It's suicide. But you just, we all think, oh, I'm going to go talk to my kids about this. And then it's like, oh, this is really awkward. But getting into a flow about it, and maybe even talk to other parents. Some people you could do it as a collective, do it as a co-op. Say, you know what? I have my village, you have your village of people. Maybe we all just come together collectively. One, it can ease the stress, but then your team, your youth are together as well as community, and everybody's getting the same message. And that's how you can also have that conversation. Here are the trusted adults.
Yeah.
We're all on the same page. So if you talk to any of these adults, you're in a safe space, but they're going to then come to me, and we're all going to come up with a plan of how to keep you all safe.
You know what I see in that instance? I see the power in a situation like that, where it's a strength, I think, that's exuded that we don't give enough credit to. So that, again, you're in the front of your children, in the front of your village, saying, like, these are your people.
Absolutely.
And if I can't meet your needs, someone here can. Or that this is the place where you would acknowledge that, and that we got you. I think that's, I never thought about it. So I had those conversations with my friends, not collectively together. And I think that's a powerful expression. And this is a great resource, I think, even being able to. So if you don't have, some of these things at your disposal, clearly why we're doing this is so that people would have a reference or a resource in order to employ this tactic. So
and you can even employ, generations behind, like, grandparents, those individuals who may be caring for your youth. You may introduce them to this concept, especially older, our grandparents and even our parents, right? Their mentality and their own bias can be an impediment, in dealing with, our children, which are their grandchildren, or, nieces and nephews. So that's another facet to maybe incorporate, next layer conversation. Because like in your case, admittedly, your parents didn't talk to you about it, which means at this phase, our parents may or may not be comfortable even talking to their grandchildren,
right.
But they're going to have interaction. So we need to make sure that, yes, we've had this conversation. This is what the plan is. If this happens, blah, blah, I need you to be aware. So that it's not just this unit, it's all out, it's outward. So just
have those conversations with them, like especially with the older generations, that just because we're having a conversation about it doesn't mean that we're feeding
or advocating.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's important. Anytime we have this conversation about suicide, is to say, just because we're talking about it, it does not mean we're giving them license. It doesn't even mean we're giving them the idea. We want them to be aware. And having the conversation does not mean that they're going to go and attempt to die by suicide. The conversation is preventative, ideally, and proactive, right? But to the generations before us, we have to have those conversations, because they're like, well, if you talk about it, they're going to go do it.
Yeah.
No, right? We're giving information. So and I think that's a great way to bring the generations in, intergenerational. We talked about, I'm sorry.
Practice. Great way to practice having the conversation.
Absolutely. Practice having the conversations. And again, bring in the aunties, bring in the grandparents, and that shows your youth, everybody's on the same page. If I go here, they got me. If I go here, they got me. If I go here, we're all on the same page. We're all saying the same language. I'm not going to go to my grandmother and be discounted because that's what she would normally do. My grandmother now has the same information that my parents do to give me a safe space and to listen and be present, right? So thinking about that, we talked about, you can talk about the social media influences if you want to. One of the main things in preparing to have the conversation is also making sure you are teaching your youth about resiliency and coping strategies, because that's a preventative measure. So incorporating that in the conversations of how to build hope, how to maintain hope, how to build coping strategies when the burdens of life hit, when those disappointments come, when they don't get into their top choice of college or whatever that is, or when they disappoint us, right? Because for some of our youth, it's the small things that can trigger them to be like, I've just disappointed my parents. I don't want to be here anymore. And so in terms of that, that's some of those preparation things, but instilling the hope, teaching them how to fail. And I say that because we are rescuers by nature as parents. I am a reformed helicopter parent. And so I can say this with my own personal comfort that, my boys had to learn what failure looked like and how to bounce back from that without me swooping in.
Yeah.
Because what happens is when they get out of our care and we don't swoop in, they don't know how to cope, which can, for some, take them to that extreme of, I just don't want to be here anymore. So that's some other ways to have conversations about what happens when you fail, because you will. What happens when something doesn't work out, or the relationship that doesn't work out, or they, whatever that is. So having those conversations built into this are preventative strategies for preventing the suicide. So let's talk about, actually talking to them, risk factors, warning signs, things like that. Looking for those changes in behavior, checking any mental health history in your own family. Was there any family of, history in your family of suicide? What does substance abuse and access and use look like for your youth, right? Is it outside of experimenting? Because they experiment at some point, most do. Again, do they have access? Do they know the difference between, a gun that's being safe or not? And do they have access to that? And do they know that it's not a toy, right? Which seems very basic, but it's very, some kids are just like, let me pick this up, and they don't know.
Based on what they see on social media, on television and video games, you can get desensitized and think that those things aren't real.
Yeah.
And they actually are.
So just understanding the risk factors, which we've talked about, and even the warning signs, but telling them and empowering them again, these are the things I'm going to be looking for. And then coming up with language within your family that these are the things I'm going to be asking you on a periodic basis, right? Or how do you want me to approach you and asking you if I have a concern, right? Because if you come up to them and be like, are you okay? They'll be like, I'm fine. But this is the other part. You have to get comfortable. If you see warning signs or if you're uncomfortable with a behavior change, asking the direct question, are you considering suicide? Or are you considering harming yourself? Do you not want to be here? Do you not want to live? Asking those specific, direct questions. I hate to say this, get comfortable, right, with the discomfort. Because a lot of times we don't want to ask the question, but asking the question is essential. We have to say it. We have to say, are you considering suicide? Do you not want to be here, right? We don't ever want to ask those, but we have to get to that point, because not asking can be more detrimental. So thinking about that, and let your, again, we talked about the safe space, letting them know they can come to you or your trusted adult without fear. So this is the other thing, without fear of judgment, ridicule, persecution, chastisement, denigrating them in any way. That's a really fine balance. And if they are coming to you, getting their buy-in to what the future looks like for them, right? Well, what are you looking forward to? And if they can't, help them. Because we can tell them all day long, you have your whole life ahead of you.
Right.
You have this, you have that. But that's not enough. They have to be able to come up with those things and be able to articulate it, and we can help foster that.
Yeah.
I think it's always important to instill their faith and how that can be very grounding, and how, the hope of God and the love of God can bring us out of those things. Variety of tools and using our biblical practices to do that. We talked about the warning signs. So the other thing too is if they have a friend or classmate that has died by suicide, knowing that they may have a heightened awareness. And for some, if they were very close, there might be that, I just want to go with them. I would rather be there. So just being aware of those types of events can possibly do that. Questions about that? How do you feel about having the conversation?
I feel better about it, and I wasn't uncomfortable talking about it, because I think like I'm the kind of person who's like, I'll just keep bringing it up,
Yeah,
until it's not, oh, here you go, talk about suicide again, like that kind of thing. And so then it becomes like, no, actually, well, maybe it's not as awkward as I
right.
think, So yeah, I'm actually good. Literally, Gavin and I went on a walk the other day, and we were just talking about basketball. I was like, how you feel? You good? Feel good?
Yes.
You all right? You don't want to hurt yourself or anything? Like, like, so, and he was just kind of like, Dad, I'm good. So I think for me, the randomness works, because it's like, even if it's not the premier thought, and if it's something that they're thinking about, sometimes in those candid moments, it's like, you know what, I actually have, or no, I didn't think about that. So for me, it's just learning how to approach it, though. Again, not from my vantage point, but in a way that they are comfortable talking about it and expressing themselves. So.
Yeah. And then once you have the actual conversation, then I suggest having, the open dialogue back and forth, and creating that dialogue, and then follow up, maybe a couple of days, couple of weeks, come back and say, hey, we had this conversation, has anything come up for you, or is there anything you want to ask? And then do those periodic check-ins, but ask your youth, how do you want me to check in? And then come up with language.
So that's so good.
Yeah.
That's so good, because I'm telling you, I think for parents, it's about our perspective, in the sense of like, I just want to make sure you're good. And I never really considered asking them, like, what does that look like for you? Like, so I'm thinking I'm checking the block by,
asking.
Yeah. And they're like, this dude's off the mark. Like, oh my God. So I think that if nothing else, that's a great way.
Youth, right?
Yeah.
And what I've noticed is, even when I was talking to them and I asked them that, they don't know the answer because they've never been asked. So like teaching them and empowering them, speak up for what you need. How do you need me to offer you support? How do you need me to check in? Because that, how was your day? It was fine. And then it'd blow you off. But asking more specific questions, or saying, how can I check in with you so we can have these conversations? So.
Might you suggest adding a layer to that? Like, for you individually as my child, what would you say are things I should look out for?
Absolutely.
When it comes to you feeling like you're isolating or not taking care of yourself the way that you typically do.
Right.
What should I be looking out for?
That's great. And even like having family self-care plans and understanding what each person's self-care plan looks like. And then when they're off, they can say, well, I haven't done this as regularly, right? Or I have been isolating. I don't want to see my friends. So that's excellent. Getting your child to be able to self-reflect and advocate. Because a lot of times we're telling them everything, and they're not being empowered to tell us. So I love that idea. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And even praising them like with the small things, like if you have a child that has history of like self-harm, and it's been like a day and you realize they have to do it, I'm so proud of you. Like I'm so glad that you're doing this. And or even have like a safe word with your child, where like just like if they feel like they can't just give you like this monologue or dialogue of what's going on, but they have like that one word, and that means like they're in a crisis. Like having that conversation with them, like if you feel like you can't tell me like exactly what's going on, but you say this word, then I know where we're at, and then you could talk about what the steps are that comes after that. But just to be able to have that safe word and that safe space for them, where even if it's just that one word, you know, like, oh, my child is in crisis,
Yes.
something is not right.
Yes, I love that. And the safe word, even like I was saying, come up with language that works within your family. That's great. Even like sometimes you can have like a card system, like, you know, red, yellow, green, that they can put on the table. Green is everything is good. Yellow is like, I'm heading to a certain direction. You know, red is like, nope, 911, we need to talk. So whatever, really think outside of the box that's less intimidating for your youth.
Yeah.
Right? Coming to you is like, oh my God, I gotta go to my parents. But throwing a card on the table that's red, it's like, okay, they know, and they know within the, say, 20-minute period of time when I throw that card out, we're gonna have a conversation. And I don't have to, it doesn't have to be so like scary, whatever. So just thinking about ways where you can engage them in like the safe word, the language, the cards, whatever works. That's a great tool. I love that. So let's talk about intervention real quick and what that looks like, because you guys are prepared. You've had the conversation. You all have exhaled. So the intervention part is really like if they come to you and they say, I want to attempt to end my life, and or you notice the signs. So there's two approaches, right? If there's an immediate or if it's just ideation. So again, ideation is just suicidal thoughts. They're thinking about it. You know, they have thoughts here and there, but it's still something to be taken seriously. But the main thing that you're going to ask for is, of course, listen to them, hear them out, explain your concern, establish safety. Don't debate whether suicide is right or wrong. Don't debate the sin nature of it. Just really be present for them. And then assess, okay, do you have a plan? Do you have means? So means could be, do they have access to a weapon, or do they have a belt, pills, things like that? If they said yes to having a plan and a means, then you need to get immediate intervention, meaning 911, take them to the emergency room, call the crisis hotline. If you call the crisis hotline, they will then give you steps to take for the next part. And usually it will be go to the emergency room. Or they can send somebody to your home. If you call 911 and go through the steps, just let them know someone is having a mental health crisis, because that's a different dispatch team than the regular police and system that they're going to send, and that they'll know, and you can say, I have someone here that's considering attempting to end their life. And you just kind of go through those steps. So one approach is, if it's an immediate need, you want to create safety. You never want to leave them alone in that time and space. Get them immediate help, especially if they have a plan and have access. If it's ideation, then create safety. And with creating safety, there's a template, like creating a safety plan, which includes step-by-step interventions that they can do. And then if they get to the point where they can't do that, then they go into crisis mode. So that means having trusted adults, having people on their list that they can talk to, if you know, things like that. But if they don't have access and a means, and they just have thoughts, have those conversations with them, try to flesh out what is really going on, and then get them in to see a mental health clinician for further evaluation. And that, you know, you want to do that relatively quickly, but it wouldn't necessarily be like calling 911. You could get resources. You can call the church for resources. The crisis, your local, every county has a crisis intervention number. You can call that number and they can tell you who in your area you can go to if it's not an immediate need. So those are kind of the intervention steps. There's always calling the 1-800 suicide lifeline, which is 1-800-273-TALK. And then there's also where they can text home to the number 741-741, and they'll access the crisis counselor as well. So those are some of the immediate intervention steps. For research purposes, if you wanted to do some research to get prepared for the conversation, Google. But then there's NAMI, which is the National Alliance of Mental Illness. They are one of the forefront organizations that provide mental health information. And, you know, you can just pull down as much or as little information as you want to share, but to prepare yourselves for that conversation. And then there's always resources to tap into to get, you know, more, you know, if you want to talk to a human instead of Googling, you can tap into us as a resource as well. So Questions, comments, preparation. How do y'all feel about conquering this?
This was good. It was a lot of very helpful tips. So you think that what you're doing is working, but then when you hear like there's other options and just what to do with how to approach them and how to, be when they do respond and come to you, it's very, very helpful.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I think for me, it's not necessarily that you're having the conversations. It's like how you are having the conversations, which can be just as important.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I'm going to be able to shift the emphasis or the focus to make certain that, again, what their experience is like having those conversations.
Awesome.
Because it's very helpful, especially thinking in terms of how to approach the kids with the kids in mind, as opposed to just what you think needs to be said. Absolutely.
Well, good. Anything you want to share real quick with anybody? Any tips you want to give parents that you either learned or something that you really want them to kind of take away from this conversation?
I think for me, just be open.
Okay.
Like these are your people. These are your children. And I'm pretty sure your children are just as important to you as mine are to me. And I couldn't imagine not creating opportunities or spaces for them to be their most authentic selves with me. And that is my job as a parent, is to make certain that they are well-adjusted individuals. And so, again, this is great. This is really, really good for me. So hopefully I'll be able to apply.
You will.
Yeah, all this good stuff.
Any other last minute comments?
Yeah, just just make sure that you're putting your kids first. Like get out of your own way, and let them show you. Like give them an opportunity to show you how to help them, and to just really listen and be there. And don't always try to be Mr. or Mrs. Fix It, but just be someone that's there so they know they can come to you.
That's amazing. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I would say examine your village
That's good.
and have those conversations with those village members.
That's amazing. Thank you all so much. I'm so glad we had this conversation. We might have to have another one, extended conversation, and maybe bring the youth on and kind of have some role playing maybe and kind of see what that looks like. But I appreciate each and every one of you and the conversation and your vulnerability and just your courage for being here to have this conversation and be so open. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having
Appreciate
us.
it. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Alfred Street. Thank you for joining us for this amazing conversation. It's time to talk. A conversation on youth suicide prevention and awareness. Last week, we spoke with our teens, and they shared with us what's on their minds. Today, we spoke with our parents, and they shared with us how difficult it can be, but how possible it is to create a space that's safe for our young people to share what's on their minds. So on behalf of our pastor, the Reverend Dr. Howard John Wesley, ASB Youth Ministry, and the ASBC Office of Christian Care and Counseling, we'd like to thank you for participating in this conversation. And as a part of this campaign, we would like to share with you all that this weekend that we're having a Lock and Talk drive-through. We're working with the Alexandria Police Department to hand out free medicine boxes. I don't know if you know, but it's really common that young people tend to overdose on medicines that are just lying around the house. So it'll be really helpful for you in your household to have a medicine box. It's free and we would love to give you one. And for those of you who own guns, there are also gun locks that are available that we would like to hand out to you all to make sure that you're keeping your household as safe as possible for everyone. So Alfred Street, again, we thank you for joining us. We hope you'll be with us this weekend at Alfred Street Baptist Church for this drive-through from 11 to 1 p.m. We thank you and we hope to see you then.